Okay, so when I was talking to Ray Sklar yesterday, so the first thing he noticed when I was talking about what we've been doing Parsha is that we've been doing very modern people. The second thing he said is, can I take the Ramban on the rainbow? I said, sure. And then he didn't. He told me he did a Rashi. But then I was listening to a shir last night, which ended up bringing up the Ramban in a way I hadn't thought about it, so we'll go from there. Okay, so let's first do bio. Okay, he's right. We should do some of the classics. So, who's the Ramban? Let's see. Gavi, Adam, since we did meet the Ramban already this week in shir. Who is the Ramban? Ramosha ben Nachman, right? When does he live? Yeah, right. Right, he lives in Spain. This is just telling which edition they use. The Ramban, as we mentioned, right, he's like the father of that school of Rishonim in Christian Spain, right, as opposed to the Rishonim in Muslim Spain. Right, these are actually very different in their sort of style. He writes a Perush on the Torah, which is literary, though often critiquing Rashi, Ibn Ezra. He's also a Kabbalist, which you find often in his Perush al Torah, that in addition to his literary, holistic analysis. By literary here, I mean, first of all, not just they pay attention to words, but the Ramban, as we've talked about in the past, thinks thematically about books, right? Books of Chumash. Right? What is this whole book telling us? What is this section telling us, rather than just the local picture that you might have in Rashi, or I don't know, Maharam, Sajagon, take your pick, Radak. He's also a Kabbalist, a student of Ezra and Azrael of Garona, of Isaac the Blind. He writes Perushim on Gemara. He writes philosophical works of sorts, right? Halachic treatises on Avelut and other things. He's the Isha Eshkolot, right? The Renaissance man. Okay. So that's the Ramban. Now, he has a piece that we discussed last year about the rainbow, but I hadn't quite thought of the point that I'm about to make until last night, and I'm bringing it up because it's the opposite of Shadal that we mentioned last week. So you remember last week we talked about Shadal, who said that it's a category mistake for the Mefarshim who try to figure out in Breshit to what extent they can either reject science because of it, or interpret science in light of it, or interpret it in light of science. It's just a category mistake, right? Shadal took the very strong view that the purpose of Tanakh is to teach moral and theological lessons, and therefore, whether or not you can successfully come up with interpretations that make scientific knowledge jive with the psukim is basically irrelevant. It's just not the process you should be taking with Tanakh. So I was listening last night to the beginning of a series of shirim by Dr. Daniel Turgeman, I think is how you pronounce his name, I'm not entirely sure, who wrote an article on this topic when he was at Weizmann on understanding Breshit in light of modern science. For those of you who were with us in Switzerland last year, right, he thinks that the key to understanding Tohu Vavohu is basically quantum mechanics, right? Arguing that, he has some interesting points, right? Suggesting that essentially the belief that, based on Einstein, that energy can turn into matter and vice versa, helps us understand what it might mean, tohu vavohu, is that before the Big Bang there isn't really matter, there is concentrated energy, which then, right, transforms into matter, which could be sort of what tohu vavohu is, some sort of undifferentiated energetic mass, I don't know. Not the point. And again, in general, I'm not sure how mutzlach these are. But he made an interesting point based on this week's parsha. Because he addressed, before he started the thing, he addressed basically the Shadal critique. right? He says, there are people who don't engage in this work at all because they're like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who believe that, look, whatever the Torah says is true, and just, right, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's approach to this basically was, if there is even a seeming implication, contradiction between science and Torah, so in many cases just reject the science and just say the Torah is right. Okay, I'm not saying he did this all the time, but in terms of creation, that was his tendency in how to read it. So that's one approach, in which case you wouldn't try to make them jive. Then there's the Shadal approach that we saw last week, which is, this is a category mistake. So before he started his particular analysis, he wanted to show that there were traditional voices who believed that the Torah can and should be a source of truths that are not just moral or theological in nature, but that there is potential to see the Torah as source of scientific truth as well, and that's not as Shadal would have it, that's a worthless enterprise. But he wanted to defend it. So one of his examples was this Ramban. Was when the Ramban gets to the question of the Keshet, of the rainbow, so what does the Ramban say? The Ramban launches into a discussion that in Rambam we talked about at least once a year, back when I was there, because it was one of our Friedman's favorite examples of people who were beholden to truth and were willing to re-look at the Torah in light of their wider knowledge base. So the Ramban says on Zodot Abrit, he says, "Mimash menot hazeh shelo haya keshet ba'anan b'maseh Bereshit v'ata bara Hashem chadasha la'asod keshet b'shamayim b'yamanan." At first glance, you look at this and you say, "Aha, the rainbow is a new creation that didn't exist in round one of creation and was created now." And then he says, and then he gives you interpretive reasons, right, which are very nice, that the bow of the rainbow looks like a bow and arrow, and why is it a symbol of peace? So the Ramban says, because God flips it upside down, so it will never look like God is shooting arrows down, because it's facing up, and that's the piece. That's the Ramban's imagery. Okay, fine, but let's leave that point. But then he says, "Va'anachnu al karchenu na'amin l'divrei Yevanim shemelat hashemesh va'avir alach ya'keshet b'tolada." He said, Elamai, I would have said that the rainbow was created only now. What's the problem? The Greek scientists tell me this is not true. They tell me that the rainbow is the natural result of the sun going through any prism, in this particular case, water. Right? So what am I supposed to do? Right? Proof? He said, what's the proof that the Greeks are right?
You can make one in your house.
In your cup, right? He said, take a cup of water. He says, because we all know you take a cup of water and it's in the sunlight and boom, you have a rainbow. He said, this is not like this. You don't need, right, fancy science. This is like when you go on, this is like when you go online and say, I've been stuck at home for 7 months. Science experiments to do at home. They say, make a rainbow in a cup, right? This is like, right? The Ramban is fully capable of this, even without, YouTube and whatever, and Pinterest and whatever's going to tell you to do. Right? He says, you can, things to do at home is make a rainbow on your table with a cup of water, right? This is not like grace. This is not,
Do you feel like he was doing peaceful acts, though?
I don't know.
Making these,
I don't know. So therefore, what does he say? He says, so he said, so I looked back at the pasuk, and I realized that my first read of the pasuk was wrong. That I originally thought that the implication was that the rainbow was created now. And then I realized, no, because God didn't say he created. What did he say? Et kashti natati be'anan. My rainbow I put in the cloud, meaning not created. That the keshet already exists. The symbol isn't the creation of the keshet, it's the placement of the keshet at this point. V'lomar ani notain ba'anan. It isn't I will put, it's et kashti natati. My keshet, which already exists, natati, I just put here. Meaning, this was something that people did recognize. The symbol wasn't the creation of the rainbow, it was the particular usage of the rainbow as part of the symbol now. Kasher amar zot, oda brit, asher ni notain. And therefore he says, skipping down, so the way you understand it is the kesher, which you might have seen since the time of creation in the cloud. From now on, this is a symbol of our Brit. Before it wasn't a symbol. That's what's new. But the physical thing is not new. So Rabbi Friedman, when I was in Rambam, always used to say on this Ramban, you see the importance of intellectual honesty. You see that the Ramban was willing to take into scientific knowledge. He was willing to admit that he made a mistake. And on second glance, he was willing to even read the Torah and realize that there was no contradiction. Right? So Rabbi Friedman always used to use this Ramban as his example of openness to science and of intellectual honesty, which it definitely is. But what this Dr. Turjaman said last night is that it's also proof that not everyone thought like Shadal. Because the Ramban clearly thinks, right? Think about the assumption of the Ramban in this paragraph is that it matters, that the Torah is telling you something, right? He said, I first read it and thought the Torah was telling me about when the rainbow was created. And then I read it again in light of what I know about modern science. I realized if I read the psukim carefully, the psukim would tell me that no. This is a natural phenomenon. And God is just using the natural phenomenon. So it's a small example, but he said, you see that the Ramban thinks as a category, it's not right. It's not a category error to say that the Torah is telling you something about reality. Because the Ramban says, I looked at the Torah again, I realized that the Torah was telling me, oh yeah, the rainbow is a natural phenomenon that God is just utilizing. And he bothers telling you about his hitlaptut, his going back and forth on what exactly the scientific information was being conveyed. And therefore, and I thought that I think he's right to note that Shadal might be right, but it's not the only voice that exists, right? There is a perspective to say there's no value at all in trying to understand how the Torah might work with science, because that's not what the book is about. But he notes that the Ramban clearly thought that, well, it may not be the main point of the book, right, to tell you scientific knowledge, but the Ramban clearly thinks that it is one of the things that the Torah tells you. Now, part of it might be, and this is where he didn't make this point, but I'll add this point. Part of it might be that, a modern thinker would overstate the point, like Shadal, because in the modern era, philosophy is very distinct from science. That's not true for ancient thinkers, right? Hence the words, as we have them in English even, is physics and then just metaphysics, right? Meaning there's a relationship between science and theology. So I think it's probably unfair to say that the Torah never bothers telling you anything at all about science, because there is an interaction between science and theology. But at any rate, I think it was a good corrective. Right? Now again, we could argue, we could say that we could agree fundamentally with Shadal and say it's not the main point of the work, and say, but maybe you can get some hints out of it, or you could say no. What I'm saying now is maybe the reason that a traditional thinker like the Ramban seems to care is because there are implications to science on theology, and therefore maybe God doesn't care about science per se, but that's part of a holistic approach to Avodah Hashem. Okay, so I think every time you go back to this Ramban, I don't think Rabbi Friedman's wrong. I think it is a good example of intellectual honesty, and even the fact that the Ramban was willing to reread psukim, right, which is quite a striking thing when you think about it. I think that's true, but I think it is also important to realize that, right, there are other voices, unlike Shadal, who think not only is it possible to tease out some scientific knowledge from the Torah, but think that might actually be a valuable enterprise. So now we've seen both sides of that perspective, and we've met the Ramban. Again, we should meet the Ramban many times, but we'll, okay.